All right, welcome back, everyone. This is part two of our lecture today on micro-sociology. In the first part, we focused on George Herbert Mead and the concept of the reflexive self, and we also talked about socialization, namely to the point of proving that the self is a social product and that we are products of our social environments. Today, we're going to look a little bit more at some contemporary sociological understandings of the self, specifically through a framework called symbolic interactionism. And we're going to look at the role of interaction with other people in constructing the self and sort of the consequences of that. All right, so symbolic interactionism was created by a famous sociologist named Erving Goffman. He lived from 1912 to 1982. He's one of the more famous contemporary sociologists, and actually his daughter, Alice Goffman, is doing some work right now, actually, to some varying controversy. Want to look that up, I welcome you to. Goffman was really interested in the sociology of everyday life. So everything in our mundane lives, how can we understand our day-to-day lives with a sociological framework? And of course, he was really interested in the social construction of the self. Okay, and he explored this in a book he wrote called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And in that book, he asked a couple questions, namely, what is the nature of social interaction? Okay, so how do interactions between people successfully happen? Sort of what are the rules of engagement in social interaction? And then more specifically, how do we construct our social identities through interaction with other people? And the second question is going to be one that's most important for us today. All right, so Goffman said that before we enter any interaction with anyone, there's a really crucial step that all of us sort of unconsciously take, and that is to define the situation. Okay, so essentially, when we walk into an interaction with other people, we kind of quickly ask ourselves, like, what is the nature of this interaction going to be? Okay, so is this interaction going to be professional? Is this interaction hopefully going to be quick, such as when you say hi to a friend on the side of the street, right, or between classes? And then also, what should we expect from other people in this interaction? Should they show us deference? Should they be sad? Should they be happy to see us? And then following that, how should we behave, right? How should we compose ourselves in this interaction? Okay, so think about the difference between how you would interact with me, your instructor, versus how you would interact with your parents, with your friends, and you know all of these differences because you define the situation for yourself before the interaction starts. So we do this by observing a few things, right? Namely, the context of the interaction. Where are you? When are you? What does that tell you about how this interaction is going to happen? Your impression of other people, right? What emotions are they emoting at that time? Are they dressed a certain way that tells you something about them if you don't know them? And then also our past experiences, right? You'll think to yourself, when I've been in situations similar to this, what happened? Did it go right? Did it go wrong? What did I do? Et cetera, et cetera. So consider these following examples, right? You walk into a room, you see that people are dressed in dark colors, someone's maybe crying. Based on your past experiences, you assume someone's died, right? Based on the dress and the emotions of the people in the room, right? So then you have to ask yourself, how do you behave and present yourself from there? You're probably not going to walk into the room and tell a joke, right? Unless it's to cheer people up. You're probably going to show deference to the grieving people, maybe talk in a hushed voice, et cetera, et cetera. This next example, right, you encounter a friend while out for a walk. They smile at you, ask you how you are, but their body language indicates that they probably can't stay and talk, right? Maybe they're kind of like leaning away from you as they're going, or they're kind of like looking somewhere else as they're talking to you. How do you proceed, right? Do you stay there and continue to talk their ear off, or do you say something like, well, it was great to see you, like, hope you're well, and you kind of let them off the hook, okay? You could do either of those things, but others' impression of you is going to be very different. And so if you want to come across as with poise, right, and having successfully sort of done that social interaction, you need to read the room, so to speak, or as Goffman would say, define the situation for yourself. Okay, so the next step after defining the situation is then you need to decide, as I've been indicating, right? How do you want to present yourself in this interaction? What impression do you want others to have of you? Do you want to come off as funny or a good friend or sympathetic or professional, right? So if you walk into a job interview and you get a sense of what this interview is going to be like, you might behave very differently, right? Whether you joke around with the person interviewing you and try and be very friendly, or whether it's very professional and you're kind of like buttoned up the entire time, right? You might make those decisions based on what kind of impression you want this person you're interacting with to get of you. Now, Goffin makes the argument that in order to give off this impression, right, the desired impression, which he calls impression management, we need to take control of the situation in some way. We need to manipulate the interaction in such a way that we come off looking how we want to come off. Okay. So we do this through a variety of tools. Okay. And as you're going to see, Goffman uses a lot of theatrical metaphors to describe this kind of interaction, and that's not an accident, right? Goffman thinks that interactions are very much kind of like a play, right? That interactions are kind of scripted and rehearsed and controlled and kind of like buttoned up a little bit. And so he deliberately uses theatrical metaphors to convey that, right? That they don't happen off the cuff or naturally, but there's kind of a deliberative quality to them. So the first tool is that of the roles. Okay, so there's lots of different social roles that we can move in and out of, such as the role of the friend, the doctor, the teacher, the parent, the sibling, the student, etc., etc. We're all very familiar with these social roles, and we kind of have an idea of what they entail, right? What's to be expected if someone's occupying that role. So when we're walking into an interaction, we're going to ask ourselves, what role do I want to take on here? And from there, we're going to decide, how do I fulfill that role, right? How do I convince other people that I'm doing a good job in this role? Okay. Part of that is by following scripts, right? So each of these roles I've mentioned follows a particular script, right? Essentially things that they say or do that we would expect someone in that role to occupy, right? So for example, if as your instructor I came onto this lecture and I just started talking about my own personal life, right? Or maybe what I'm baking this week, that would be off script, right? And that would be a little jarring for you guys, and I would not be as credible as an instructor, right? You probably wouldn't respect me in that role as much as if I was actually teaching. Okay. Second, we have what he calls the front stage and the backstage, right? And again, you'll see this theatrical metaphor popping up here. This is to describe the division between where we're acting out these roles and where we're prepping for the roles. Okay, so Goffman says that the front stage is the place where we're acting, right? We're acting out this role. We're trying to convince other people that we are doing a good job in this role. Okay. The backstage is a place where we prepare for that role. That could mean a variety of things, right? So maybe, for me as an instructor, it means preparing lessons, right? Or getting ready in such a way where I look professional, right? And I convey that. For a parent, the front stage would be when they're taking care of their children, right? Interacting with them. The backstage might be when they're talking with their partner about issues they're both encountering, or reading parenting self-help books, or talking to a therapist or fellow friends who are parents and asking them for advice. Okay, so in any role we have, we move in and out of this front stage and backstage. So at a given time, we're on the front stage, we're performing the role, trying to convince people of it. And in the backstage, we're preparing for that role so we look more credible. The interaction goes smoothly when we're ready. Finally, we have what Goffman calls props. Again, the theater here. These are just material objects we might use to help make us look more credible in that role, right? So if you're a teacher, maybe it's, I don't know, having the right clothing on that looks professional, right? Maybe, if you're an elementary school teacher, having like a yardstick that I don't know. We always had, when I was in elementary school, yardsticks, and teachers would use them to point to things. I don't know if that's still the case, but essentially these material items that help you convey that you are occupying that role in that interaction, right? And then you are managing your impression in such a way. All right, so let's go through an example then to give you guys a better idea of what this looks like. All right, so for this example, we're going to talk about a doctor's office. Within a doctor's office, there's lots of different roles that someone might occupy, right? So obviously we have the doctor, we have the patient, the nurse, the receptionist. All of these people are occupying different roles, and they mean different things, right? We expect different things from each of them. Each of these roles follows a given script, right? So you can think about what standard things do doctors and nurses do and say when you interact with them in a doctor's office, okay? What do you anticipate from your interaction with them? Okay, and so when we all go into a doctor's office, we vaguely know what to anticipate, right? It might vary from doctor to doctor, but we have a pretty good sense of what that interaction is going to look like because they follow a script, right? And if they were to go off script, we might be a little peeved, we might be uncomfortable, right? Or we might find them uncredible in some way. The doctor's office also has a front stage and a backstage, right? So you can think about the difference between the doctor when they're in their personal office, maybe reading files or just taking a break, versus how they are in the examining room with you, okay? In the backstage, the doctor might even complain about patients to nurses or the receptionist, right? Versus they would not do that in the examining room. They'd be polite to you, hopefully, right? And listen to all of your problems. Similarly with the nurses, right, that they have that front stage and backstage. Receptionists might act really differently to your face as a patient versus when you're gone, right? And they can relax a little bit and take off that role and not have to perform the role of the receptionist with you. And then finally, we have lots of props in the doctor's office, right? So the doctor might have a clipboard, a stethoscope. The white jacket is a really big giveaway, right? They might have degrees on their wall. All of these kinds of materials are there convincing you, as someone they're interacting with, that they're the doctor and they therefore command your deference and they're the authority, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, we've all been in interactions that don't go smoothly or maybe how we planned, right? And these are what Goffman refers to as interaction disruptions. Okay, so often in interactions, things won't go smoothly because there's either contradictions. Okay, so for example, two people will try and express authority at the same time, and we'll have to sort of figure out who's in a position of authority here and who's supposed to show them deference. There might be misunderstandings, right? So for example, maybe you're coming home from being out with friends and you're all happy, and you don't realize that your parents are mad at you for some reason. And so that initial interaction is confusing because they're annoyed or mad and you're happy and don't really know what's going on. Okay. There might also be discrediting interactions where someone tries to occupy a particular role, and the other people in the interaction just aren't having it, right? They don't believe it for some reason or another. Maybe they haven't executed the script correctly, or they don't have the proper props, or whatnot. But that role is not successful in some way, and that individual has to reevaluate what their place in the interaction is. In any of these instances, Goffman says that actors have to save this production, right? That in order for the interaction to continue, the actors need to figure out the contradiction or the misunderstanding. And this doesn't always happen smoothly, right? We kind of blunder our way through it often. But that actors need to save the production and compensate for this in some way for the interaction to continue. Right, so why is this important? What can we take away from this for the future? The big main point I want you guys to get here is that this shows us that the self is dependent on our social context, right? So all of us have multiple selves that we need to balance at one time. For example, the doctor we talked about might also be a mother, a friend, a mentor, et cetera, and depending on the context, they move in and out of their role. So when they're home, they're not a doctor, they're maybe a mother or a wife, etc. But when they're in the office, their identity as a mother is much less important than their identity as a doctor. Okay. What this shows us then is that our self is never separate from our social environment, right? And it's very much a product of interaction, that without that interaction with other people, we actually don't have much of a sense of self, because it's through interaction that who we are is defined, okay, in relation to other people. So some of you might be thinking in this point, because this is kind of like the big question people always have, is what about when you're alone? What about when you're in your room and you're not interacting with anyone? Don't you have a sense of self then, or do you not have a sense of self? And to that, I would say you would need to be a hermit to truly be separate from society. You would need to have been born in the woods and raised by wolves, literally, and never seen another person to really be separate from society. Okay. Think about the fact that, number one, interactions are frequent, particularly now with social media, right? We're almost always in contact with other people. And even when we're alone and not interacting with others, we're also prepping for future interactions. And this is where that concept of the backstage comes in, right? So say you're alone in your bedroom, lying on your bed, you're thinking about what happened that day, and you're thinking about, well, what am I going to do tomorrow? And maybe I'm going to call my friend. And it's even just thinking about this interaction that we're prepping for it, right? We're thinking about what our role will be in those interactions and how we want those interactions to happen. Okay. All right, so I want to do something a little different for this discussion post. All right, so in order to answer these questions, you're going to need to first watch a short but funny video, right? And I've linked this video in the module. It's called the Frasier discussion post video. Okay, so as the title probably gives it away, in this video clip, we're going to be watching a segment of a clip. A segment of an episode of Frasier, which, as a giveaway, is one of my favorite shows. So you don't need to know much about Frasier to watch this show, but the setup is that our main character, Frasier, and his brother Niles, they purchase a restaurant, but they're not chefs or restaurateurs. On opening night, their waiters and their chef quit, and so it's up to them and their friends to operate the restaurant themselves and to successfully convey to other people that they are a fine dining experience. Okay, so the first step is go watch that video, hopefully have a good laugh. I think it's amusing. And then I want you to address these questions in your post. Okay, so what definition of the situation is Frasier striving for in this scenario? Where is the front stage and the backstage, right? So where do we see him moving in and out of those places? What roles are being acted out? What kind of roles are different characters in the show trying to convey to other people? What props are being used to convince other people of these roles? And then when does the interaction start to break down, and why does it start to break down, using Goffman's terms, right? So thinking about contradictions, misunderstandings, or discrediting specifically. Okay, and as always, post your comment, and then also comment on a classmate's post to have a discussion about what they thought as well. All right, guys, that's going to conclude us for today. I will see you in our next lecture where we're going to be talking about groups, networks, and organizations, focusing more on macro sociology. All right, and I will see you guys then.